17 complaints, 5 excessive force allegations. But today, he messed with the wrong one. The morning air felt thick, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin even before the sun fully rises. Detective Mark Reynolds stepped out of his car, shutting the door with more force than necessary. It was a miserable start to the day, testifying in some pointless case that, in his opinion, could have been handled with a simple report. But the DA insisted he show up in person. His jaw clenched as he walked toward the courthouse in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The parking lot was half full, mostly lawyers and clerks already moving like they had somewhere important to be. Reynolds didn't care. His mind was already on the testimony. What to say, what to leave out, how fast he could be out of there. Inside the courthouse lobby was the usual mess. Low chatter, footsteps echoing, attorneys checking their phones. He scanned the space out of habit, eyes moving over security, clerks, and a group of people standing near the entrance to the main courtroom. And that's when he saw her. A black woman, standing near the corridor leading to the judge's chambers, speaking to a group of attorneys. She was too confident, too sure of herself. The way she stood, the way the others listened, it rubbed him the wrong way. Reynolds was already in a bad mood. He didn't need any extra distractions. His steps were deliberate as he walked toward her. No badge was visible, no ID, nothing. Just another loud voice in a place where people like her usually had one of two roles. Either they were here to argue a case, or they were waiting to be processed. "Ma'am," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the authority he was used to. "You can't be here. This is a restricted area." She turned to him, meeting his gaze with a calm expression. No fear, no hesitation, just annoyance. "Excuse me," she asked. Her tone made his blood boil, like she didn't recognize who he was, like she wasn't taking him seriously. "I said," Reynolds repeated, stepping closer, "this area is for court officials and law enforcement only. If you don't have business here, you need to move along." A couple of the attorneys glanced at each other, but no one spoke. "I have business here," the woman said, crossing her arms, "and I don't think I need your permission to stand where I'm standing." Reynolds let out a sharp breath. Here we go. But he had no idea what was coming next. Reynolds's patience was already razor thin, and this woman's attitude wasn't helping. He squared his shoulders, planting his feet firmly on the polished courthouse floor. "Look, I don't have time for this," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I'm not going to ask again. You need to." "I don't need to do anything," she cut in smoothly. The way she said it, so controlled, so unbothered, made his stomach tighten. Who the hell did she think she was? His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to remind her that he wasn't just some security guard. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. A smirk flickered across her face. Not nervous, not intimidated, just amused. "Do you?" she shot back. The attorneys behind her were watching now, uncomfortable, like they knew something he didn't. One of them, a younger guy in a grey suit, opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but then stopped himself. Reynolds felt the shift in the room. A quiet tension, like everyone was waiting for him to figure something out. But he wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm done talking," he said, stepping forward. "Let's go. Now." She didn't move. His irritation snapped into something sharper. Reynolds reached out, grabbing her arm. The moment his hand made contact, everything changed. It wasn't a hard grip, nothing excessive. At least not by his standards. But the second he touched her, the group around them reacted. Sharp gasps. A sudden movement from the side. Then, "Detective Reynolds, stand down!" The voice hit him like a brick. A firm hand gripped his wrist, pulling him away before he could even process what was happening. Another officer, Sergeant Daniels, stood there, his face a mix of panic and disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniels hissed under his breath. Reynolds frowned. "I'm handling a situation." Daniels' eyes widened, then darted toward the woman, the one Reynolds had just grabbed. She adjusted her sleeve calmly, brushing off the moment like it was nothing. But the energy in the room had completely changed. Daniels looked like he wanted to slap him. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" he whispered harshly. Reynolds stared, his frustration boiling over. "She's trespassing," he snapped. "If she has a problem with—" "That's Chief Williams." Silence. A long, stretched moment of complete dead air. Reynolds's mind tripped over itself. The words didn't fit, didn't make sense. Chief, who? And then, like a slow-moving wreck, it hit him. Lana Williams, the new chief of police, the one they'd been talking about at the precinct, the one they said was coming in from Austin, the one he hadn't bothered to learn about because he figured she wouldn't last long anyway. The attorneys around them were dead silent. Some looked like they wanted to disappear. Others looked like they were trying not to enjoy this too much. And Chief Williams? She just stood there, watching him. Her face was unreadable. Then, after what felt like a year, she finally spoke. Her voice was even, measured, deadly calm. "Detective," she said, "we'll talk about this in my office." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. But this was only the beginning. Reynolds stood frozen. The room had closed in on him, the courthouse walls pressing tighter, the weight of his own actions settling like a lead brick in his gut. Chief Williams. The new boss. The woman he had just grabbed like some random protester blocking his path. A cold wave of realization crashed over him, but his face didn't change. Years in law enforcement had taught him one thing: never let them see you sweat. But right now, every single person in this room was watching him, waiting for his next move. He swallowed hard. "Chief." Williams raised a hand. Not another word. She didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't flex her power. She just turned to the attorneys, nodding once. "Excuse me, gentlemen." That was it. No drama, no scene. Just a quiet, devastating power move. She walked toward the exit without looking back. Daniels nudged him, hard. "Move," he muttered under his breath. Reynolds's feet felt like lead as he followed her out of the courtroom lobby, past the confused courthouse staff and into the long hallway that led toward the offices upstairs. The walk was silent. Dead silent. Every step echoed, his own heartbeat pounding louder than his boots against the polished tile. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind was spinning. This wasn't just some embarrassing mistake. This was career-ending. Williams wasn't some fresh-out-of-academy rookie with something to prove. She was a seasoned leader, the kind with connections, the kind that could pull a single string and unravel everything. By the time they reached the chief's office, the tension had thickened to something suffocating. The door shut behind them with a quiet click. Williams walked over to her desk, placed her hands on the polished wood, and exhaled slowly. Reynolds stood stiffly, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. She didn't sit, didn't tell him to either. Instead, she turned, arms crossed over her chest, and looked at him like she was reading through every mistake he had ever made. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but unshakable. "Detective," she said, "walk me through what just happened." Reynolds opened his mouth. But for the first time in his career, he had no good answer. What was he supposed to say? That he saw a black woman standing in a courthouse and assumed she didn't belong? That he thought she was another activist in the way? That the only reason he even looked twice was because she was too damn confident for his liking? Williams watched him struggle. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to make him feel it. "I asked you a question," she said. Reynolds cleared his throat. His voice, when it finally came out, wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. "I didn't recognize you." She nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "And that justified you putting your hands on me?" He knew there was no right answer to that. "Chief, Don't," she interrupted. "Don't try to explain it away. I've seen it too many times." Reynolds pressed his lips together. This was bad. Worse than bad. Williams stepped around the desk, closing the space between them. She wasn't tall, but somehow she made him feel small. "I'm going to be very clear about something," she said. "This department has protected officers like you for too long. That ends now." Reynolds' stomach turned. Every instinct told him to fight back, to defend himself, to do what he'd always done. But for the first time he wasn't sure it would work. And that terrified him. But the fallout was just getting started. Reynolds had been chewed out before. By sergeants, lieutenants, even an old precinct captain who had a habit of slamming his fist on the desk for dramatic effect. But this was different. There was no shouting. No red-faced ranting about making the department look bad. Chief Williams didn't need to raise her voice to rip him apart. She let the weight of his actions speak for itself. "Do you know how many complaints you have on file?" she asked, tapping her fingers against the desk. Reynolds kept his face blank. "No, ma'am. 17. He felt that number like a punch to the ribs. Williams tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a specimen under a microscope. "That's not including the ones that were lost in paperwork," she added, her voice flat. Reynolds didn't flinch, but his fists clenched behind his back. She knew. She knew exactly how the system worked. The quiet reassignments, the missing footage, the well-timed retirements of IA investigators who had been reviewing a case one minute and packing up their desks the next. She wasn't guessing. She had receipts. Reynolds finally spoke, keeping his tone measured. "I do my job, Chief. I do what's necessary." Williams leaned back slightly. "Necessary?" He could feel her baiting him. He should have stopped talking. But something bitter pushed him forward. "This city isn't kind to weakness," he said. "We're not out there giving tickets for expired plates. We're dealing with criminals who—" Williams held up a hand, a silent command, and just like that, he stopped. "You think I don't know what kind of city this is?" she asked. Reynolds didn't answer. Williams exhaled slowly, tired, but not defeated. "That's the problem with officers like you," she said, more to herself than him. "You think you're keeping order. You think you're the last line between good people and bad people." She met his gaze again. Sharp, unforgiving. "But what you really are is predictable." Reynolds' jaw tightened. Williams walked over to the file cabinet in the corner, pulled open a drawer, and grabbed a single thin folder. She placed it on the desk. It had his name on it. "You've been given more second chances than you deserve," she said. "This time, there won't be another one." Reynolds felt the blood rushing in his ears. He had spent years learning the rules of the game. He knew how to survive in this system. But Williams wasn't playing by those rules. And for the first time, he didn't know how to get ahead of it. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Finally, she sighed. "There's going to be an investigation," she said, "and I suggest you start thinking about what you'll say when Internal Affairs calls you in." Reynolds stared at her. "So, that's it?" Williams gave a small, humorless smile. "No, Detective. That's just the beginning." And for once, Reynolds didn't have a way out. Reynolds sat in his car, staring at the dashboard, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. An internal investigation. That was the kind of thing that could end a career. His career. He had spent years in the department, learning exactly how to navigate grey areas. He knew which supervisors to avoid, which ones would cover for him, and which ones didn't care as long as the paperwork was clean. But Chief Williams? She was the variable he hadn't accounted for. Reynolds had always thought he understood power. Who had it? Who didn't? How to control a room with his presence alone. But today he'd seen what real power looked like. It wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about control. She never raised her voice, never lost her temper. She let him destroy himself. And now he had to sit in that destruction and face what came next. The next morning, Reynolds walked into the precinct, feeling every set of eyes on him. They knew. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Sergeant Daniels barely glanced at him when he passed. A couple of younger officers whispered behind their hands. A few veterans, the ones who had been untouchable for years, kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. And then there were the others, the ones who looked at him like they were waiting to see if he'd survive this, waiting to see if the department had finally changed. Hours later, the meeting came. Internal Affairs, a union rep, Chief Williams sitting at the head of the table, calm and unreadable. They laid out the facts. 17 complaints, 5 excessive force allegations in the past 2 years. A pattern. He could fight it. He could deny it. He could do what he'd always done, lean on the system to protect him. But he knew the truth. The system wasn't on his side anymore. She wasn't on his side. He was out of options. For the first time in his career, he was forced to do something he had never done before. Take accountability. "I overstepped," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Williams didn't react. "I shouldn't have put my hands on the chief," he continued. "I made assumptions about someone I didn't recognize, and I let my frustration get the best of me." There, the words were out. He didn't expect sympathy, didn't expect a pat on the back, and he didn't get one. Instead, Williams closed the file in front of her and looked him in the eye. "This department isn't a place for men who can't control themselves," she said. Reynolds felt his chest tighten. "Consider this your last chance," she said, "and don't think for a second I won't be watching." She wasn't making a promise, she was making a guarantee, and just like that, the meeting was over. Reynolds left the room feeling something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. He wasn't fired. Not yet. But his reputation was cracked. His position wasn't bulletproof anymore. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure where he stood. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Power isn't about force. It isn't about fear. Real power is about accountability. It's about knowing that sooner or later, you answer for what you've done. Some people learn that the easy way. Others, like Reynolds, have to be dragged to the truth. How many people like Reynolds exist in places of power right now? How many get away with it because no one holds them accountable? And more importantly, how do we change that? If this story made you think, share it, talk about it, because the more people speak up, the harder it becomes to ignore the truth.